Morning, everyone. We're going to roll right along. I'm Isaac Rakowski. I'm a vice president in SAP in the retail group. For those of you who don't know, SAP provides software and services to 82,000 companies in 120 countries across the globe. That includes thousands of retailers across the globe, many of whom are in this room. I'm here to introduce Fred Fox, who's going to be our next speaker. Fred is the president, CEO, and co-founder of Planalytics, the world's leading source of business weather intelligence. Planalytics provides critical information, analysis, and services that drive improved business performance for companies throughout the retail, restaurant, and consumer packaged goods, energy, life sciences, and financial services industries. He's a key architect and inventor of Planalytics technology platforms and is an author on over 24 U.S. and international patents. Mr. Fox has been a pioneer in the commercial utilization of business weather intelligence. He is widely quoted and published in the business media and is a frequent speaker on technology programs like CNBC and Fox News and at industry conferences. Mr. Fox is a member of Young Presidents Organization and sits on the board of several technology companies, including Aware, a GIS location-based business analytics software company. Mr. Fox also serves on the board of directors of several philanthropic institutions, including Gratz College, UJC Young Leadership Cabinet, and is a co-founder of the Philadelphia Israeli Network. He is passionate about making Jewish educational opportunities affordable for everyone who seeks a Jewish education and has worked for years as the former chair for the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia's Center for Jewish Life and Learning's Day School Advocacy Council. He's also a member of the Federation Jewish Education Steering Committee. Mr. Fox has also been active with the Chabad Lubavitch in Chester County and serves on its Building Fund Committee. Mr. Fox received a BS degree in engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology. So Fred Fox, everyone.
All right, we just have to get this up and running, which will take a minute, I'm told. But as we're doing it, everyone always asks about the weather. We live it, we breathe it, we understand it. And last night I was talking to a gentleman who said, "What are you talking about?" Well, I said, "I'm talking about the impact of weather on retail traffic." And he looked at me with a puzzled look in his face and said, "Weather, retail, traffic, what do the two have to do with each other?" And that's something that I get often. Weather is one of the greatest drivers of consumer behavior, shopping patterns, and ultimately traffic. Yet it is the least understood. It's one of the least measured. It's something that until now, very few people have paid attention to. And so what I'm hoping to do today in the presentation is to give you my 12 years of experience measuring the impact of weather on consumer buying patterns, and more importantly, how companies are using that knowledge to change their course, are using that knowledge to go after consumers, to drive them into their stores, because they know, before their shoppers know, exactly how weather's going to drive them. So with that, we'll get into the presentation. And just a little bit about Planalytics. Founded in '96, we work around the world with over 250 companies, helping them to measure and manage the impact of weather on their traffic. So business weather intelligence is what we're going to talk about first. Go through a few definitions of what it all means, because I think you're going to need that later on to understand just how vast it is. I'm going to try this piece here. Okay. Down, up. Nope, it didn't work. Okay. Backwards, hold on. Okay, there we go, got it. So when everybody thinks of the weather, this is what you usually think of. a weather map. But weather maps are hard to use. And what we found years ago is that most people can look at the weather, they can understand the weather because it drives all of us, but they can't really action it. So what you have to do is take that raw weather data, which you see on the news, which you read in the paper, get off the internet, and turn it into actionable information. And that type of information can be, as this example shows here, when Campbell Soups is going to sell soup, which is all based on when weather is going to drive their consumers into shop. Our last speaker spoke of the feelings that consumers have. Well, what do you feel to have a bowl of Campbell Soups? You have to feel cold, you have to feel a chill, and that's going to make you think of soup. Now, if you know that weeks or months ahead of time, think of what you can do to help people drive into your store to buy your brand. So some of the things we talk about, business weather intelligence, is about helping you understand how weather is going to impact you, how you're going to action it. This photograph I have on the left here, I actually got in the paper when I was in London a year ago. And it's of Brighton Beach, April 6, 2008 versus 2007. 2007, people are on the beach, it's happy, which in England, if it's 40 degrees out, people are on the beach. It doesn't take much there. But look at it the next year, April 6. There's snow on the ground. In fact, you can even see the snowman that someone built. So weather is the most volatile variable driver that's out there. And look at how it changes one year to the next. So questions that retailers and manufacturers ask about weather is, the first thing is, was it the weather? Did my sales go up or down last week, last month because of weather? Was it because of our brands? Was it because of the events? So sorting that out has tremendous value. And then the next thing is, how much of it was the weather? So if weather drove people into our stores, what did they buy, where did they buy, and how much did our events or ads or pricing or brand have to do with it? So it's about sorting out the impact of weather. And the next thing is, how do we action the weather? So how do we leverage this knowledge of how weather is going to drive our consumer to do something about it? Because after all, if you just understand it and can't use it, then it's really not worth much. Why even bother? Why not just accept it as it is? And then finally, how do we plan for the weather? How do we use it? So when it comes to weather and translating it into actionable information, we start with some what we call foundation data. One, you need good, clean weather data. Temperature, SIP, days of sun, which sounds easy, but it's not easy because it's very messy, so it's got to be cleaned up and organized. Then we start with consumer data, which is point of sales data. And the wonderful thing about this industry is that it's rich in data. We get data every time we go into the store to buy something that's recorded. And the weather impact that's taking place is in those records. So you can extract exactly how weather affected the consumer on that day or week just by looking at the data. And finally, market data. How they feel, what is our competition doing, prices, all those things. And all that's needed to really create actionable information. So again, data, and we and others get data from all over the world, clean it, database it, to drive our models. What are those models? Those models consist of over 400 pre-built categories. Now let me explain what this is. We've been engulfing point of sales data for over 12 years and measuring it. And over that time, we've built a knowledge base of how weather drives consumers to shop or not shop in every zip code in the US, Canada, in Europe. And those relationships are the threshold temperatures, those relationships are the pre-SIP, which are all different. So for instance, if you look at one of these categories, let's just say fleece, and let's say women's fleece, which is different than men's fleece. Women's fleece in Minneapolis in the month of December sells when temperatures drop below 25 degrees. We know that because we've measured it over and over again. That same week in Atlanta, it starts to sell when it drops below 40 degrees. And in Miami, Florida, that same week, it starts to sell when it drops below 55. So people really are thinner skinned the further south that you go. It's what they're used to. It's how you feel. And it's the change as well in that feeling. It's also about demographics. So in Florida, for instance, on a nice warm spring day, they will sell shorts in Tampa, Florida. Makes sense. But in Miami, on a nice spring and warm day, they won't sell shorts. They'll sell it when it's raining. Why is that? Because Miami has a much younger demographic that's outside doing things when the weather's nice. They shop when the weather's poor. Some markets, such as California, rain drives fire log sales. In the east, it's temperature, it's cold. And in the northern Great Lakes, it's of course snow. So different types of weather, different regions trigger, and it's a moving target. So we've measured it and databased it. Some other definitions, and then we'll get into the good stuff here. I'm going to use the term de-weatherization. De-weatherization is a methodology that we came up with to extract the weather out of last year's point of sales data. Now, keep in mind, most businesses, especially most retailers and their vendors, plan off of last year. Well, if last year's weather has a 25% chance of repeating itself, which it does, and you're using last year's sales data for a seasonal product, then you're building in an inaccuracy of 75%, which means you're better off flipping a coin than taking last year's data and putting it into your plan. So what we do is we extract that data. It's very simple. We line up one of our categories with a client's category. So for, let's say, again, going back to that fleece example, and we normalize it. We bring it back to a normal level. Very simple process. Most retailers do that on their own. You know, they say, well, last year was this. We're going to go here with this year. But when you're talking about multiple markets, multiple products, it's a pretty complex thing. So we do it right away. So de-weatherization is the act of taking weather out of your data, bringing it back to a normal to get a cleaner baseline. And that cleaner baseline has an effectiveness of about 80%. So you go from having an ineffectiveness of 75 to having one of 75-80. Weatherization is another term we use. I just heard the president use it about a week ago, but he's talking about keeping homes warm. What we're talking about here is putting weather back in. So when we get into a 2-week rolling basis, you can then take your National Weather Service forecast, put it into your product models, and look at how weather will drive consumer behavior over the next 2 weeks on an ongoing basis. So you don't have to guess at what consumers are going to do. You know, using just short-range weather. And finally, weather-driven demand, which is a percentage change that weather is going to impact your sales over last year. So now we got that, we will move on with the presentation. So Mother Nature. Mother Nature is the last great driver of retail traffic. Why is that? Well, because consumers today are spending less focusing on needs, or they're focusing on needs and not on their wants. They're buying basics. They're making fewer trips to the stores. They're buying at the time of need. Now, this is a very critical point, because when you buy at the time of need, it's also how you feel. And weather has a big impact on that. They're buying more value, as you heard Terry say, or what I've heard a lot of our clients say, fresh, and not just the price. And they're facing different economic conditions where they are, which is where localization has a huge impact. And weather is the greatest local event that is happening on a day-to-day basis. So need is fundamental. Need is buying food when you need to eat. It is buying water and sodas when you're thirsty or when it's hot. It is buying clothes in the winter to keep you warm, and different clothes in the summer to keep you cool. It's buying boots to keep you dry in the fall and winter, and it's buying sandals to let the air in over the warm summer. Skin lotions in the wintertime to keep your skin from getting too dry, and skin lotions in the summertime to keep the sun off. Allergy during pollen, lawn and garden during spring, humidifiers, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. So need does not wait for a sale event or a holiday. Need is immediate, need is now. And weather is a fundamental driver of need. In a down market, where purchasing power is certainly diminished, lower price is a constant across the retail and environment. We heard Terry talk about value earlier. Consumers are purchasing more basic consumables and discretionary fashion. Weather becomes an even larger driver of traffic into a store. And in fact, I would say weather becomes a dominant factor. Now, to retailers and manufacturers, when you say weather is a dominant factor, they automatically assume that means that we're not counting promotions, events, great branding, great stores, all of that. And in fact, that's not really true. Weather is the great equalizer. It doesn't care what store you shop in, but weather drives all consumers up or down at the same time. So as a retailer, you still have to do everything else to capture a larger percentage of it. And I think you heard Terry talk about how hats, gloves, and scarves did very well at Macy's last fall. Well, there was two good reasons for it. One, the weather impact. The weather-driven demand numbers were 30–40% over what they were last year for the fall period. It was a great fall season from a weather point of view. And second, Macy's probably did an excellent job executing and attracting that traffic that was going to buy something warm into their stores. So those two things have to take place. But let's look at what it really means. And what I'm going to show you now are just slides of how much the weather actually affects certain goods and services. When I started doing this 12 plus years ago, I needed to get my hands on some retail data to actually measure it. And a friend of ours, David Wax, who founded Charming Shops, I went to him and I said, David, have you ever measured the impact of weather? Now, David started Charming Shops with his brother and another few friends after he got out of the service in the Second World War, with one store on Front Street in Philly. So this is a hard-nosed rag merchant who built a 1,000-plus store chain. And David, of course, said, no, why would I ever look at it? I know weather affects me. Why do I need to measure it? But I was able to talk David into giving us data. And sure enough, that data showed the impacts were tremendous. So high that neither he nor even I believed that we had done our modeling right. So we took it to the smart guys at the Wharton School and had them look at it. And the smart guys at the Wharton School said, well, you did make some errors. In fact, the impact is greater than you thought. So when we look at the impact of weather, what we're looking at here is women's sandals. We're looking at on a week-by-week basis during the months of March, April, and May. And we're looking at several things. The line you see that graph is off of is last year. And the green represents weather-driven demand above last year. The red represents weather-driven demand below last year. And that blue line are the actual sales. And so, as you can see, the sales line for women's sandals in these markets, Los Angeles and Chicago, are tracking amazingly close to the weather. Sales and weather follow each other for women's sandals. And in Chicago, that's probably a mix of warm temperatures and dry weather. In LA, it's really the same thing. It's all temperature driven, although rain there during the spring season can really dampen the sale of sandals. Now, the amazing thing is, on these charts on the left, the R-squareds we're looking at are 50, 60%, which means in these markets, in these months, the change in sales, 50, 60% of the time, can be explained directly due to weather. That's a huge number, folks. That's saying that of all the things that people do, weather is having a huge impact on the sale of these sandals. If you look at a more traditional product that you would expect to see, such as air conditioning units, the same thing. About 50, 55% of the sales here could be explained due to weather in these markets. Again, air conditioners are temperature-based. They're threshold-based, which means lower temperatures, let's say in March, April, will drive sales. You get a few days in the high 80s. By August, you need about a week in the 90s to drive sales, just because people get conditioned to hotter temperatures. Men's outerwear, same thing, fall product. Except men's outerwear, for those women in the room, you'll be glad to know that men's outerwear is much more affected than women's outerwear. Men's outerwear has an 85% R-squared to weather. 85% of the time that you see these sales changes can be explained to weather. Why is that? Well, women from all of our data tend to plan ahead to purchase merchandise. So the weather effects are more downstream. Men wait to the last minute until they're miserable, and that's when they purchase. And the data proves it. Again, short sleeve shirts, the same type of thing, 50, 60% are squared. Flea and tick collars for dogs. In fact, another interesting fact is that the most weather-affected apparel product that we've ever looked at is not men's apparel, it's not women's, it's not even children's, which is very high. It's pet apparel. Pet apparel. Why? Because when it gets cold out, those who own small dogs go right into the store and they buy a sweater. So I don't know what that's saying about our society, if people care more about their pets and their kids, but that's what the data shows. Rubber boots, the same thing. So we can go on and on. My purpose here is just to show you quantitatively that weather is a very large driver of consumer purchasing patterns, and therefore a large driver of general traffic. It's up to each retailer to try to harness that traffic into their store versus their competitors. Another way of looking at it, this is looking at the gap, looking at the impact of weather on March sales. And as you can see, this is going back March to 2001. You can see right here that March sales, when it comes to gap total sales for the month of March, temperature has a huge impact on total national store volume. From a very high level, you can look at that. And this is from our friends at G2 Weather. So you can see that even looking at it from a high level, now let's even go higher and look at national month-to-month comp store sales. As you can see, when you put comp store sales numbers over weather-driven demand number, it matches pretty well, except for those few months towards the end of the year, October, November, didn't really match as close, where the economy, in this case, really trumped the weather in a general sense. So how do you use business weather in intelligence? How do you action it? This is a typical product life cycle graph, and weather flows through every part of a retail and manufacturing product life cycle. It affects, in the preseason, it affects demand planning, shaping, promotional planning, merchandise planning, allocation, where you want to de-weatherize your data. In the in-season, it affects replenishment, it affects markdown strategies, pricing, all of that. And post-season, it drives you to look at how did weather affect you. This is another view of it. So for weather integration, the first thing that people should do is to weatherize their plans in the preseason. You take the weather out of your data and to get a clean basis for planning. And then in season, you incorporate those factors for pricing and markdown on a 2-week rolling basis. We have a few case studies here, and I'm just going to go through 2 quick studies just to show you how retailers are actually using weather now. This is a very simple study here applied to store planning and clustering. Every retailer has a store cluster. And when it comes to the climate, they typically just throw some stuff up on the board and say, this seems cold, this seems warm. This client asked us to redo their clusters. Now, they had Florida hot, they had Texas is hot, they had Arizona's hot, Albuquerque's cold. I don't know if there's a rivalry between the 2 states, but it didn't make sense. So the mission they gave us was to break it down into just 5 categories. So we worked through their Oracle system and did a de-weatherization of all their data and redid it and looked what happened. It changed. Florida became tropical. The Southeast became hot, humid. Southwest, hot and dry. Basic stuff, but it was geared towards their customers and how they purchased. If you apply it to a scattergram and take all their products from all their stores and just weatherize it, look what happens. It all organizes right away into a climate zone. Another example is in the markdown timing. And here, one of our clients used this for hats, scarves, and gloves this past winter. And what they did was look at the weather impacts on this category across all their markets. Now, red is negative weather-driven demand. We're looking at weather factors here. And green is positive. And what they saw was that the end of the season was actually going to be pretty good. After a light January, sales again were going to pick up towards the February time frame. Now, if you were running any type of a seasonality curve and you were looking at inventories, your system would have been telling you something much different. Your seasonality curve, which would have been based on several years of data average, would have said your sales should be going down as you go through February and March. Your inventory levels, because it was a weak January for those sales, would have said inventories are high. And so what your system would not have shown you is this, that in fact, when you applied a weather-adjusted curve to it, based on how weather was actually going to drive it, all of a sudden it looks like a different picture. Even though that curve is going down, off that curve you have pretty significant sales that should be taking place, meaning that the weather that's going to be is going to be cold enough to drive consumers into the stores, even that late in the season, to purchase these goods. And so because your inventory systems would have been high from the month of January, they would have been recommending an immediate price cut to get that merchandise through. In fact, when you applied a weather-adjusted curve to it, it recommended a 13-day delay. Now, those 2 weeks may not seem like a lot, but when it comes to a short seasonal product like hats, gloves, and scarves, if you can get 14 more good selling days out of the end of the season to clear inventory at a higher price, that's tremendous. That can make or break your entire season. So when you apply that, what this client got was a sell-through of 94% at the higher price, and the margin was raised 7.4%. So that's how weather-based intelligence can really change the very way that retailers can plan an action. And finally, that we have the systems today, we have the technology to easily measure that impact and leverage that across a broad array of stores, any place in the world. And that when you do that and apply it back into your existing planning, allocation, replenishment infrastructures, the benefit of knowing what your consumers are going to do before they know what they're going to do is huge. So, any questions? Yes?
Your models are very future-looking. Give us some feedback on how accurate forecasting is versus what actually happens when you go back.
Sure. Well, when it comes to weather forecasting, the state of the science is about 2 weeks out. So in preseason, we do what's called a de-weatherization. We take weather out of last year's data and get a clean baseline for planning next year. And that very simple process has about an 80% effectiveness of being on the right side of the trend. So that's how we get clients about 11 months out. Just by taking the weather out of their last year data, normalizing it, they're much closer to what's going to happen than they usually are. When you get into a 2-week window, then we add back in the National Weather Service forecast into these models, then look at what actually is going to happen based on what the government data is showing. Yes?
Yes, I was interested in knowing if you've looked at the same sort of predictability in terms of services, because all the examples—
In terms of what?
In terms of services such as hotels or airlines or spas, because the examples that you gave were, I believe, all products, product-driven retailers.
Well, weather drives traffic. So we work with companies such as McDonald's and Subway and others where really all we're looking at is traffic and how weather's going to drive traffic in or keep them out. So when it comes to hotels, you obviously have the same thing, that good weather, let's say in Buffalo, or let's say lousy weather in Buffalo in the early fall will drive bookings in Florida, and even it's more so up in Canada. So if you have a mild fall in Canada, bookings in Florida tend to go down.
Thank you.
Quick question on over towards your left.
Left. There you go.
Almost said right, but that would be for myself. Quick question for your multi-channel clients. Have you done any kind of analysis of how, at an aggregate level across channels, or looking at how that might be different for a store base versus their online base?
Yes, and weather impacts the online as much as it does the bricks and mortar channels. It's a different impact, but in some ways, poor weather that keeps people out of stores, and this is very intuitive, drives up traffic. So lots of snow, lots of cold, freezing weather drives the purchase of warm weather merchandise from an online channel. When you get into spring, summer, it also drives it, but less so. Why? Because people tend to be outside more in good weather. So weather has a much greater impact in the fall, winter on online purchasing than it does in the spring, summer.
10 years ago, when I was a buyer in the Midwest, I used the Farmer's Almanac to help me determine if I should be more aggressive in my outerwear purchases. Does that have any more relevance? Do you use that at all?
Well, no, we don't really use any weather forecast past 2 weeks because it's just not reliable. And even if they are merchants who hate black boxes, would never use it. So that's why we use a de-weatherization, which is very accurate in giving them the trend of where the season's going to go. But feel free to use the Farmer's Almanac. Anyone else? Any other questions? All right, thank you.